The millionaire CEO had built his world on logic, control, and silence, until the day a letter arrived from the woman he hadn't seen in 6 years, revealing that she was gone, and had left behind 2 sons who were his. Edward Harper sat at the head of the long glass table in the conference room, nodding absently as another quarterly figure was projected onto the wall. His assistant slid a fresh stack of reports in front of him, but something unusual caught his eye. Nestled between spreadsheets and stock forecasts was a plain envelope, handwritten, unmarked except for his name. It was so out of place in this polished, digital world that he almost pushed it aside, assuming it had been misdelivered. But something about the handwriting made him pause. He stared at it longer than necessary, a strange unease curling in his chest. Then he knew. He recognized the writing. Hannah. He hadn't heard that name, hadn't said it out loud, in 6 years. Not since she disappeared from his life with no warning, no note, and no goodbye. He had tried to forget her, buried himself in mergers and luxury and order, told himself whatever they had wasn't real enough to miss. But his hand trembled slightly as he opened the envelope, as if his body had known better all along. Inside was a letter and an official-looking document from Child Protective Services. He pulled out the letter first and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was just as he remembered, looped, clear, intentional. The first line stole his breath. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone." His heart dropped into some place that didn't care how many billions he had earned. The room around him faded, the voices muffled, and all he could hear was the sound of his own pulse as he read on. She wrote that she had been sick. That she hadn't told anyone, especially not him, because she hadn't wanted pity or interference. That she knew he had moved on, or at least told himself he had. But she had kept a secret. A truth she couldn't die without trying to share. She had 2 sons. Twins. 5 years old. And they were his. Edward's vision blurred. His fingers tightened on the page. She wrote that if the letter had reached him, it meant she didn't survive, and the boys, Liam and Noah, were now in the care of the state. She begged him, not out of obligation or guilt, but because she had known once who he really was. She believed there was still a part of that man left. The official document beneath confirmed everything. Names, dates, location of the temporary care facility. A copy of her will. He didn't remember standing, but suddenly the chair was pushed back and someone in the room was calling his name. He didn't answer. He walked out of the meeting without explanation, the letter still clutched in his hand. His car was waiting downstairs, but for the first time, he didn't know where to go. He sat inside, staring straight ahead, the traffic outside a blur of meaningless motion. Hannah was gone. The woman he had once imagined building a life with had died without ever telling him the most important thing of all, that he was a father. And somewhere, 2 little boys with her eyes were waiting. He had missed 5 years. He had missed her last days. But he would not miss what came next. The drive to the Child Services office was a blur. Edward didn't remember how long he sat outside the building before going in. The sky was dull, the air heavy with the kind of stillness that came before a storm, but inside him, everything already felt like it had collapsed. The receptionist greeted him with a cautious smile when he gave his name, as if she knew exactly why he was there. She made a quick call, and within minutes, a woman named Karen met him in the waiting area. She introduced herself as the caseworker for Liam and Noah. She looked at him carefully, as though assessing whether she saw anything fatherly behind the expensive suit and guarded expression. Without much small talk, she gestured for him to follow her. They walked down a narrow hallway lined with faded posters about fostering and family reunification. Karen glanced over her shoulder and said, "The boys don't know who you are yet. We only tell children what we can confirm. So far, you were listed in the letter and the will, but nothing more." Edward nodded. He appreciated the professionalism but couldn't stop the growing sense of guilt pressing on his chest. She led him to a small room with a large observation window. Inside were 2 boys sitting on a rug, building something out of plastic bricks. They were identical, dark brown hair, pale skin, and large blue eyes that stopped Edward's breath. Hannah's eyes. They were both dressed neatly in hand-me-down clothes, clean but slightly too big. One of them spoke softly to the other, and they both laughed in unison. It was such a normal, gentle moment, and yet it felt monumental. "They're doing okay, considering," Karen said quietly. "It's only been 2 weeks since their mother's death. They were with her when it happened. Ambulance couldn't get there in time. She passed at home." Edward swallowed hard and looked away. He felt like an intruder standing on the outside of a world that should have been his. He should have known. He should have been there. "Can I meet them?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Karen nodded and opened the door. The boys looked up when he entered. For a moment, no one spoke. Edward crouched down, not too close, just enough to meet their eyes. "Hi," he said gently. "My name's Edward." One of the boys, he thought it was Liam, tilted his head slightly and blinked, then returned to stacking his blocks. The other one, Noah, watched him without saying a word. Edward stayed quiet, letting them get used to him. After a few minutes, Liam said, "Are you here to take us to a new house?" Edward hesitated, then replied carefully, "I'm here to get to know you. If that's okay." Liam shrugged. "We've had 3 people visit. One brought cupcakes." Edward smiled faintly. "I didn't bring cupcakes. But I could try next time." Noah finally spoke. "Do you know our mom?" The question landed like a weight. Edward looked straight at him and said softly, "Yes. A long time ago. She was very important to me." Noah nodded slowly. "She had a picture of you in a book. She never told us your name, but she said if anything happened, someone good would come." Edward couldn't speak. His throat tightened. He had come in expecting to feel like a stranger. But somehow, even in her absence, Hannah had given him a bridge into their lives. He stayed with them for nearly an hour, helping build towers and watching them argue and then laugh again. He didn't try to correct them or force anything. He just stayed. And when Karen told them it was time for dinner, Liam looked up and asked, "Will you come back tomorrow?" Edward nodded. "I will. If you want me to." Noah didn't speak, but he came over and quietly handed Edward a red brick from their building pile. Edward took it as more than a toy. It was the beginning of something fragile, something new. And this time, he wouldn't let it go. The next morning, Edward woke earlier than usual. Not because of meetings or alarms, but because his mind was already racing before the sun even rose. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't on contracts or negotiations. They were on 2 boys with blue eyes who had asked if he would come back. He stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie, only to pull it off and toss it on the bed. It didn't feel right. Instead, he pulled on a sweater and jeans, clothes he hadn't worn in public in years. He looked more like a man than a title, and for once, that felt like the point. He stopped by a small cafe on the way to the center and asked the barista if they had cupcakes. They only had muffins, but they were warm and soft and came in pairs, so he bought 2. When he arrived at the facility, Karen was waiting in the lobby. She smiled slightly when she saw the paper bag in his hands and said, "They'll like that. They've been asking about you since breakfast." It struck him again how quickly children attach themselves to hope, and how terrifying that hope could be if left unmet. He followed her down the hallway, his chest tightening with a mixture of nerves and something deeper he wasn't ready to name. This time, the boys were in a different room, a small classroom with bookshelves and art supplies. They sat at a table coloring, and when they saw him, both froze for just a second before Liam broke into a shy grin. "You came back," he said, not as a question but as a confirmation of something he had dared to believe. Edward nodded and sat down across from them, placing the bag on the table. "I brought muffins," he said. "They're not cupcakes, but I think they're close." Noah reached forward first, taking one and peeling the wrapper with careful fingers. Liam waited, watching Edward as if measuring his presence. Then he took one, too. For the next hour, they colored together in silence and in chatter, depending on the minute. They asked him questions: where he lived, what his car looked like, if he knew how to make pancakes. He answered everything honestly. Then came the question he hadn't prepared for. Liam looked up and said, "Are you our dad?" Edward's breath caught. He had known it would come eventually, but not yet. He looked between them and said gently, "Yes. I think I am." Noah blinked, wide-eyed. "How come we didn't know?" Edward looked down at the drawing he was shading in and said, "Because I didn't know either. Not until a few days ago." They were quiet for a while, processing. He let them. He didn't push. Later, while the boys went to the playground, Karen pulled Edward aside. She said the temporary custody paperwork could be started if he was ready. The state would still evaluate him, check his home, and monitor the transition. He said yes before she could finish. He knew he wasn't ready in the way that word was usually used. He didn't have the answers, didn't know how to braid hair or fix bruises, didn't know bedtime routines or favorite songs. But he was ready to try, and that was something Hannah had believed he could do. That evening, he stood in the middle of his penthouse and realized how much it looked like a life designed for no one else but him. Everything was gray and clean and expensive, and yet none of it looked like home. He walked from room to room thinking about where twin beds might go, if there was enough space for a play area, whether the echo of silence in the halls would sound different with laughter in them. The next day, he bought a second-hand bookshelf, some art supplies, and a calendar with dinosaurs. He wasn't just preparing for a visit. He was preparing for a life. One he hadn't known he needed until two boys looked at him and asked if he'd return. The transition to temporary custody happened faster than Edward expected. Within a week, the paperwork had been filed, the interviews completed, and the home inspection approved with minimal comment. The caseworkers were surprised by how well prepared he was, but they didn't know that every free moment he had was now spent researching parenting blogs, visiting toy stores, and rereading Hannah's letter for clues about the boys' routines and preferences. He asked Karen if they had any comfort items, favorite blankets, toys, even old pajamas, but she told him the boys had arrived at the shelter with almost nothing. That fact haunted him more than he let show. When the day came to bring them home, he arrived early with two matching jackets folded in his hands. He found the boys in the same playroom as before, seated side by side building with blocks. Liam was the first to see him and ran toward him without hesitation, while Noah followed more slowly, holding a drawing that he refused to let go of. It showed three stick figures holding hands, and under it, in uneven handwriting, it said, "Us." Edward crouched down and opened his arms, uncertain if they'd accept the gesture, but both boys pressed into him like it was already the most natural thing in the world. The ride to his penthouse was filled with soft questions from the back seat. Liam asked what the building looked like and if it had a rooftop. Noah asked if there was a bathtub or just a shower. Edward answered every question patiently, trying to speak in the reassuring tone he had heard other parents use. When they finally pulled up to the sleek glass building in the heart of the city, he hesitated before helping them out of the car. Would this place, so cold and curated, ever feel like home to them? Inside the apartment, everything felt different than it had the day before. The hallway was still wide and the floors still polished, but now there were crayon drawings taped to the fridge, two small backpacks by the door, and a dinosaur nightlight glowing faintly in one corner of the living room. The boys wandered through the space slowly, touching things, asking what was allowed and what was just for show. Edward laughed more than once, realizing how little in his life had ever been touched by curious hands before. Later, he gave them a tour, pointing out their room, which now had matching beds with soft blankets, a stack of books on the nightstand, and twin nightlights they had picked out together. He showed them the kitchen and the bathroom and let them each choose which cabinet they wanted their things in. The first meltdown came just before dinner when Noah couldn't find the drawing he'd carried in. He panicked, tears spilling before Edward even understood what was happening. But instead of freezing or retreating like he once might have, Edward knelt beside him and helped look until they found it under the couch. He framed it that same night and hung it above their shared bed. After dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup, both slightly burnt, Liam asked if they could watch a movie. Edward said yes and sat on the couch with them, one boy curled on each side. He didn't follow the film. He just sat there listening to their quiet laughter and felt something settle inside him. It wasn't peace exactly, or joy. It was responsibility. It was belonging. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep and the apartment had gone quiet, Edward stood outside their door and just listened. He thought about Hannah and what she must have gone through, getting sick, raising twins alone, writing that letter with no guarantee it would ever be read. He thought about the years he'd wasted thinking his life was full simply because it was scheduled. And now, here in the stillness of a room filled with small breaths and nightlight shadows, he realized how much more there was to feel. He didn't know what the next week would bring, or if he'd be good at any of this. But he knew he would try. Not to make up for lost time, that wasn't possible. But to honor it. To build something new in its place, day by day, story by story, bedtime by bedtime. The first full week with the boys was a blur of routines that didn't yet feel like routines. Edward quickly learned that mornings with children were nothing like the silent, solitary sunrises he was used to. There was cereal spilled across the counter, missing socks discovered only after shoes were on, and endless negotiation about what kind of toothpaste tasted less spicy. By the third day, he stopped wearing white shirts at breakfast and started keeping an extra pair of socks in the kitchen drawer, just in case. It was chaos, but it was their chaos now, and it slowly began to shape something that resembled a family. Liam was the early riser. He would always be up first, wandering sleepily into the kitchen asking for toast or to sit on Edward's lap while he sipped his coffee. Noah took longer. He would emerge only after he heard Liam talking or the sound of cartoons drifting from the living room. Edward respected their rhythms. He didn't rush them unless school demanded it, and even then, he tried to make the rush feel like an adventure. Some mornings they listened to music while brushing their teeth, and other days they made it a game to see who could get dressed fastest. Slowly, they started to smile more in the mornings. That felt like a win. The nights were harder. The boys still asked questions. About their mom. About what would happen next. One night, as Edward tucked them into their beds, Liam looked up and asked quietly if he would still be there in a year. Edward sat on the edge of the bed, unsure how to answer. Not because he doubted himself, but because he didn't want to say anything that sounded like a promise if it didn't feel absolutely true. He said, "I can't tell you what every year will look like. But I'm here now. And I want to stay. That's my choice." Liam didn't say anything. He just reached out and held Edward's hand until he fell asleep. That same night, Edward stayed awake long after the boys had gone to bed. He stood at the window looking out over the city, the skyline glowing beneath the clouds, and wondered how many other people out there had built their lives so high only to realize they had nothing solid beneath them. He thought of Hannah again, how strong she must have been to raise two boys alone and how much she must have feared for their future when her own became uncertain. He ached with the guilt of absence but tried not to let it drown out the gratitude of being here now. Throughout that week, Edward made time to read to them every night. He found books with dragons, astronauts, and magical trains, each one more exciting than the last. The boys started to argue over whose turn it was to sit closer to him, and eventually, they settled on the obvious solution, one boy on each side, leaning against him as he read in a voice that was getting better at sound effects. They laughed more. They hugged him without hesitation. And once, when Noah scraped his knee running through the hallway, he ran straight to Edward without a second thought. Edward didn't flinch. He scooped him up, cleaned the wound, and whispered, "You're okay. I've got you." It was a small moment, but the kind that echoed. The school called once to ask about emergency contacts, and Edward realized with a pang that there was no one else to list. No grandparents. No close friends. Just him. The boys had no backup plan. That made everything feel heavier, but also clearer. He didn't want them to ever feel like they were waiting to be taken away again. They needed roots. Not just shelter, but permanence. And slowly, day by day, Edward began to believe he could give them that. By the end of the week, the apartment looked different. The boys' drawings were now taped to more than just the fridge. Their laughter filled the empty hallways that had once echoed with silence. Their shoes were lined up at the front door beside his. And every night, when he turned off the light in their room and listened to their even breathing, he felt something unshakable settle in his chest. He was still afraid. But he wasn't running. He was staying. And they, somehow, were staying too. By the middle of the second week, the boys had started calling the apartment home without thinking about it. Edward noticed it first when Liam said, "Can we go home now, after school pickup?" The way a child says something that feels ordinary to them but extraordinary to someone else. That word, home, meant something completely different now. It wasn't about square footage or high-rise views. It was about routine, presence, safety, and the growing comfort between them. Edward had started rearranging his life to make room not just physically but emotionally. His calendar, once color-coded and packed from morning to night, now had blank spaces labeled dinner, pickup, and bedtime story. His assistant didn't question it anymore. That week also brought its first parent-teacher meeting. It was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, and Edward had rehearsed what to say. But when he sat across from the kindergarten teacher and heard her describe the boys as kind, curious, and slightly shy, he found himself getting unexpectedly emotional. She said they were adjusting well and had already made a few friends. She also mentioned that Noah had told the class his dad picked him up now and made the best toast ever. Edward smiled, thanked her, and walked out of the school with a lump in his throat and the faint realization that he was already more than temporary in their lives. Back at home that evening, Noah brought him a drawing. It showed 3 figures again, Edward, Liam, and Noah, but this time there was a 4th figure in the sky, drawn with long hair and a heart on her chest. "That's Mommy," Noah explained. "She watches from the clouds. But you're the one here now." Edward knelt down and took the picture carefully, as if it were made of glass. He wanted to say something wise, but his voice caught, and all he could do was pull Noah into a quiet hug. Moments like these didn't ask for speeches. They asked for stillness. And love. One night that same week, Edward found a small box tucked in the back of the boys' closet while searching for extra socks. Inside were 2 photographs, one of Hannah holding the boys when they were babies, and the other of her and Edward, taken years ago, smiling on a beach. He hadn't even known she kept it. That evening, after the boys were asleep, he sat alone in the living room holding the photo, staring at the past and feeling the full weight of it. Not just the loss, but the second chance buried within it. He whispered her name, a thank you and an apology wrapped into a breath he didn't know he was holding. Friday brought a surprise. The boys wanted to cook dinner, pasta, their favorite. Edward was skeptical but agreed, and they spent almost an hour boiling water, over-grating cheese, and dropping noodles on the floor. It was a mess, but when they sat down at the table and said cheers with their juice boxes, he realized it was the best meal he'd had in years. Afterward, they curled up on the couch to watch a movie, and both boys fell asleep halfway through, their heads resting on his shoulders. He didn't move. He just sat there, the blue glow of the screen washing over them, a quiet contentment filling the room. Later that night, as he carried them one by one to bed, Edward caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. He looked tired. Softer, maybe. But more whole than he ever had. He was no longer living in fragments of what might have been. He was living something real. He placed the drawing Noah had made on his nightstand and turned out the light. Then he stood at the door for a while longer, just watching them breathe. It wasn't just that he loved them. It was that they loved him back, and trusted him enough to sleep deeply under his roof, with no doubt he'd still be there when they woke up. On Saturday morning, Edward woke up before the boys and found himself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of an apartment that no longer felt silent at all. Even in stillness, he could hear them, the quiet rustle of blankets from the next room, the memory of their laughter echoing from the day before, the trace of their little feet running across the hardwood floors. It was strange, the way they had already filled the space, not just physically, but emotionally. The once minimalist penthouse was now scattered with toy cars, books with bent covers, socks that never seemed to stay paired, and drawings of dragons and spaceships on nearly every wall. But what filled it most was the feeling of being needed, seen, chosen. When he entered the boys' room, Noah was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed with his stuffed animal tucked under his arm. He looked up and whispered, "I didn't hear you come in." Edward smiled and crouched beside him. "I didn't want to wake you." Liam stirred in his sleep and rolled toward them, mumbling something about pancakes. Edward laughed softly and said, "I think that's a request." They spent the next hour making breakfast together, badly. The pancakes were misshapen, and the syrup ended up in places syrup should never be, but they ate every bite, proud of the mess they'd made. Later that day, Edward took them to the park, the one with the large wooden ship in the middle of the playground that they had pointed out every time they passed it in the car. The boys ran ahead while he sat on a bench nearby, watching them climb and yell and call for him every time they reached the top. "Look, Dad!" Liam shouted, waving from the highest point. Edward's heart clenched at the word, still not used to hearing it out loud, but more and more grateful each time it came. He waved back and stood up, walking closer, pretending not to panic as Noah jumped from a platform and landed hard on the ground before standing up triumphantly. For the first time, Edward felt less like he was playing a role and more like he was simply living one. That evening, they returned home just as the sky turned pink with the setting sun. They all kicked off their shoes at the door and dropped their jackets in a heap. Dinner was quiet, tired from the day, and after they were bathed and in pajamas, Edward read them one of Hannah's favorite childhood books, the one with the lost star trying to find its way home. When the story ended, both boys asked him to stay a little longer. He lay between their beds on the rug, one hand resting on each mattress. They talked softly in the dark, and at one point, Liam said, "I think Mom would have liked it here." Edward didn't respond right away. His eyes stung, but he didn't let the tears fall. He said, "I think she would have loved it." When they finally fell asleep, he walked into the living room and poured himself a glass of water, standing in front of the large window overlooking the city. The skyline looked the same, but everything in his world had changed. His phone buzzed, emails, missed calls, but he didn't check them. Instead, he picked up the framed photo of Hannah and the boys as babies. He looked at her smile and whispered, "I'm doing my best." There was a peace in knowing she had believed in him, even when he hadn't deserved it. And there was power in trying to live up to that belief every single day. Before going to bed, he walked one more time down the hallway and opened the boys' door just enough to see their shapes curled beneath their blankets. They looked so small, so safe. And for the first time since they had come into his life, he didn't feel like he was holding his breath. He felt grounded, steady. He knew there would be challenges ahead, questions he couldn't answer, fears he couldn't erase, but tonight, all that mattered was that he had stayed. And they had let him. The day of the final custody hearing arrived with a weight that Edward felt deep in his chest from the moment he woke up. He hadn't told the boys much about what was happening, only that it was an important meeting and that he needed to make sure everything was set so they could officially stay together forever. They didn't ask for details, but Liam had quietly slipped his favorite dinosaur sticker into Edward's suit pocket before they left the apartment, and Noah had asked if he'd be home in time to help with their science project. It wasn't fear that Edward carried with him that morning, it was the fragile hope of making something permanent out of something he never expected to have. At the courthouse, the halls were quiet, lined with beige walls and worn-out floors, and the sound of every footstep echoed a little too loud. Karen met him at the entrance of the courtroom, holding a folder filled with documents, but her smile was soft and steady. She told him the judge had reviewed everything and that barring any unexpected developments, things would move quickly. He thanked her, but his hands still trembled slightly as he smoothed the front of his jacket and took a deep breath. The room was plain, lined with wooden benches and a single table near the front. When the judge entered, Edward stood with a straight back, every part of him trying to reflect the truth of who he'd become, not just the man he'd been. The judge asked questions about the boys' routines, their school, their health, their behavior. Edward answered everything honestly. He didn't pretend he had figured it all out. He spoke about burnt pancakes and bedtime books and missing socks. He talked about how Liam liked to sing quietly when he didn't think anyone could hear and how Noah had started collecting stones from every place they visited. He mentioned the frame drawing above their beds and how every night when he turned off the lights, they said goodnight to their mom before whispering goodnight to him. And then the judge paused and looked directly at Edward and asked, "Are you ready to be their father?" For a moment, the room was completely silent. Edward's throat tightened, but his voice didn't waver. He said, "I already am. I wasn't there at the beginning, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, and I will be here as long as they'll have me. This isn't about filling a space their mother left behind. It's about building something new that honors what she gave them, and gives them a future they can trust." The judge nodded slowly and smiled, not formally, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had heard not just an answer, but a truth. With a few final words and a signed order, it was done. The custody was permanent. The boys were his. On the way home, Edward stopped at a small bakery and bought the biggest chocolate cake they had, the kind with bright icing and colorful sprinkles, and he had them write, "Welcome Home," across the top in blue. When he walked into the apartment, the boys were on the floor surrounded by crayons and construction paper. Liam jumped up first and asked, "Is it done?" and Edward knelt down and opened his arms. Both boys ran to him, and he hugged them so tightly it felt like the final piece of something broken finally fit back into place. He whispered, "You're mine. And I'm yours. Always." That night, they had cake for dinner and stayed up past bedtime watching movies. Edward didn't care about the mess or the clock. He cared that both boys fell asleep tangled beside him on the couch, warm and safe and full of sugar and certainty. As he carried them one by one to bed, he looked around the apartment, no longer seeing it as a space filled with expensive things, but as a home filled with stories, memories, and a kind of love he had never known was possible. Before going to sleep, he pulled out the photo of Hannah one more time and placed it beside the framed drawing on the nightstand. He didn't speak this time. He just looked at her and hoped she would know, wherever she was, that he had heard her. That he had shown up. That the family she once built alone was now being carried forward with hands that finally understood what it meant to hold something fragile and never let it go. The playground was alive with the sounds of laughter and running feet, the swings creaking in rhythm and the slides glinting under the midday sun. Children darted from one corner to the next, their voices mingling in a chorus of carefree joy. But near the jungle gym, a group of kids had gathered, their play interrupted by raised voices. At the center of the commotion stood two girls. One was white, her blonde hair tied back in a neat ponytail, her face flushed with indignation. The other was black, her braids adorned with colorful beads that clicked softly when she moved. Her expression was a mix of confusion and discomfort, her hands gripping the straps of her small backpack as if seeking an anchor. "You don't belong here," the white girl shouted, her voice sharp and loud enough to silence the chatter around them. "This is our playground. Go play somewhere else." The words cut through the air like a knife, their impact visible in the black girl's widened eyes. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Her gaze darted around, searching the faces of the other children for support, but all she found were frozen expressions and hesitant glances. "What are you waiting for?" the white girl continued, crossing her arms. "Just leave already." The black girl lowered her head, her braids swinging forward to obscure her face. The playground, once filled with laughter, was now eerily quiet. Even the swings seemed to have stilled, their creaks swallowed by the heavy silence. Slowly, she turned and began to walk away, her small frame hunched under the weight of humiliation. As she retreated, the other children parted to let her pass, their whispers starting to rise. Some exchanged uneasy looks, while others avoided her entirely, pretending not to notice. But a few, the quiet ones who usually stayed on the sidelines, watched her go with a mixture of guilt and sadness. They wanted to speak up, but fear of being targeted themselves kept their mouths shut. The white girl remained where she was, her arms still crossed, her stance defiant. But as the black girl disappeared from view, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. For a brief moment, her confidence faltered, and she glanced at the other children. Their stares weren't as approving as she had expected. A boy near the swings muttered something under his breath, shaking his head before turning away. The playground slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the energy had shifted. Laughter felt forced, games lacked their earlier enthusiasm, and the jungle gym remained oddly deserted. Though no one said it aloud, the weight of what had happened lingered in the air like a shadow. The black girl, now sitting on a bench at the far edge of the park, stared at the ground, her fists clenched in her lap. The sting of the word still echoed in her mind, a wound that refused to fade. She thought about standing up for herself, about saying something, anything, but the moment had passed, and she felt the crushing weight of silence. Nearby, an older woman seated on another bench watched her quietly. Her weathered face showed no judgment, only a deep sadness. After a while, she stood and approached the girl, sitting beside her without a word. The girl glanced up, surprised, but the woman simply placed a hand on her shoulder, offering silent comfort in the absence of words. Back on the playground, the white girl's bravado had begun to crack. She sat on the edge of a slide, watching as the other children avoided her gaze. The confidence she had felt moments ago was replaced by an uneasy knot in her stomach. For the first time, she wondered if she had gone too far. The walk home felt longer than usual. The black girl trudged along the familiar path, her small backpack bouncing slightly with each step. Her gaze was fixed on the sidewalk, watching the cracks pass under her feet like a slow, deliberate march. The noise of the playground still echoed faintly in her ears, but it wasn't the laughter or the squeals of children that stayed with her. It was the sharp, cutting words, "You don't belong here." When she reached her front door, she hesitated. The house, normally a place of warmth and safety, suddenly felt too bright, too open. She didn't want her parents to see her like this, to ask the questions she wasn't ready to answer. With a deep breath, she adjusted her expression, forcing a small, unconvincing smile before stepping inside. Her mother was in the kitchen, humming softly as the smell of something warm and savory filled the air. "You're home early, sweetie," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "Did you have a good time on the playground?" "It was fine," the girl mumbled, kicking off her shoes and heading straight for her room. Her mother paused, her hands stilling for a moment before she turned back to her cooking. She knew her daughter's usual excitement, the way she would chatter about her day, spilling every detail with boundless energy. But today was different. The silence felt heavy, like something unsaid was hanging in the air. In her room, the girl dropped her backpack on the floor and climbed onto her bed, pulling her knees to her chest. She stared at the wall, her mind replaying the scene over and over again. The words felt like a slap, echoing louder each time she remembered them. "Go play somewhere else. You don't belong here." Her chest tightened, and her eyes stung, but she refused to cry. Crying felt like admitting defeat, like proving the other girl right. She pressed her face into her knees, hoping the tight ball she had curled into would somehow shield her from the feelings threatening to overwhelm her. As the afternoon faded into evening, she heard a soft knock on her door. "Dinner's ready," her mother called gently. "I'm not hungry," she replied, her voice muffled. There was a pause, the kind that said her mother wanted to ask more but wasn't sure how. Finally, the footsteps retreated, leaving her alone in the quiet. That night, the girl lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the shadows danced in the dim light of her nightlamp. Her mind wouldn't stop racing, every detail of the playground etched sharply into her thoughts. The way the other kids had stared, their faces frozen in shock or discomfort. The way no one had spoken up. And most of all, the way the other girl's words had made her feel, small, invisible, as if she were nothing more than a mistake. She thought about what she could have said, what she should have done. Maybe if she had yelled back, maybe if she had stood her ground, it wouldn't feel so heavy now. But she hadn't. She had walked away, her feet carrying her before her mind could catch up. And now, the silence in her own head was deafening. She clenched her fists under the covers, anger bubbling beneath the surface. But it wasn't just anger at the girl on the playground, it was anger at herself. For not being stronger. For not knowing how to fight back. For letting the words sink in like they had some kind of truth. In the other room, her parents sat at the kitchen table, their unfinished dinner pushed aside. Her mother's face was tight with worry. She barely said a word, she murmured. Something happened. Her father nodded, his brow furrowed. We'll talk to her in the morning. Maybe she just needs time. Back in her room, the girl finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with fragments of the day's events. The words haunted her even there, twisting into shapes and voices she couldn't escape. And when she woke in the middle of the night, her pillow damp with tears she hadn't realized she'd cried, the heaviness still hadn't lifted. For the first time, the world she thought she knew, the playground, the kids, even herself, felt different. Smaller. Darker. And the scars it left weren't just on the surface, they were the kind that didn't fade easily. The sun rose reluctantly the next morning, casting a pale light over the neighborhood. The white girl sat at her breakfast table, absently poking at her cereal. Usually, mornings were her favorite time, chatting with her parents, planning her day, but today felt different. The words she had shouted on the playground played over and over in her mind, each repetition bringing a faint sting of regret. "Ready for school, sweetheart?" her mother asked, placing a packed lunch in front of her. She nodded mutely, her appetite gone. "Yeah," she said, though her voice lacked its usual cheer. On the walk to school, she clutched her backpack straps tightly, her steps slower than usual. The thought of facing the other kids made her stomach twist uncomfortably. She tried to reassure herself, it wasn't a big deal. She left. It's over, but the knot in her chest told her otherwise. When she arrived at the playground before class, the usual bustling energy felt different. The kids were playing, laughing, running, but there was an undercurrent she couldn't quite name. As she approached the jungle gym, a group of girls stopped talking abruptly, their eyes darting toward her before they quickly turned away. Her cheeks burned. She walked past them, pretending not to notice, but the whispers started as soon as she passed. "That's her," someone murmured. "Did you see what she did yesterday?" another voice added, quieter but sharp enough to cut through the morning air. She pretended not to hear, but the weight of their words settled on her like a heavy blanket. For the first time, the playground didn't feel like her territory. It felt like a stage, with all the other kids watching, silently judging her. In class, the whispers continued, more subtle but no less piercing. A boy sitting 2 rows behind her nudged his friend, gesturing in her direction. Another girl gave her a pointed look before leaning over to whisper to her desk partner. Though no one said anything directly to her, the message was clear, they had seen what she'd done, and they didn't approve. Her teacher, oblivious to the tension, called on her to answer a question about yesterday's reading assignment. She stumbled through her response, her thoughts scattered. When she finished, the teacher smiled and moved on, but a boy across the room muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear, maybe she should stick to answering questions instead of kicking people off the playground. Her face flushed with embarrassment. She clenched her hands under the desk, her nails digging into her palms. By lunchtime, the weight of the morning had grown unbearable. She carried her tray to her usual table, but the group of friends she always sat with seemed hesitant. One of them offered her a tight smile but said nothing, while another glanced away, avoiding her gaze altogether. "Hey," she said tentatively, sitting down. "Hey," one of the girls replied after a pause, her tone clipped. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Normally, they would be chattering about their plans for recess or the latest show they all watched, but today the table was quiet. Finally, one of the boys stood up, grabbing his tray. "I'm gonna sit over there," he said, nodding toward another table. "I don't really want to hear about yesterday." Her stomach dropped as he walked away, joined by another friend who muttered something about needing a better vibe. She sat there, frozen, her appetite completely gone. The words she had shouted the day before echoed in her mind again, but this time they felt heavier, louder, impossible to ignore. After school, she walked home alone, her head down. The usual chatter and laughter of the other kids seemed distant, like a world she was no longer part of. Her mind churned with questions she couldn't answer. Why did I say that? Why did I do it? Was it really that bad? But deep down, she knew the answer. It wasn't just about the other kids' reactions. It wasn't even about what she had said. It was the look on the black girl's face as she walked away, quiet, hurt, defeated. That image stuck with her more than anything else, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts like an unanswered question she didn't want to confront. When she reached her house, she went straight to her room, shutting the door behind her. Sitting on her bed, she hugged her knees to her chest, the knot in her stomach tightening. She wanted to believe it didn't matter, that it would all blow over, but the uneasy feeling in her heart told her otherwise. For the first time, she began to understand that words, once spoken, could never be taken back. And that understanding was heavier than anything she had ever carried before. That evening, the white girl sat at the dinner table, pushing peas around her plate with her fork. Her parents were engaged in their usual conversation about work and errands, but the tension in her posture didn't escape their notice. Her father, a tall man with a warm but serious demeanor, finally set down his knife and fork and looked at her closely. "Everything okay, kiddo?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. "You've been awfully quiet today." Her mother glanced over, concern flickering across her face. "Something happened at school?" The girl shrugged, her eyes fixed on her plate. "Not really," she mumbled. Her parents exchanged a glance. They had learned by now that when their daughter got like this, a simple "not really" often meant, "Yes, but I don't want to talk about it." Her father leaned forward slightly. "Honey, you know you can tell us anything, right? If something's bothering you, we'd rather hear it from you than from someone else." The girl hesitated, her fork pausing midair. Finally, she set it down with a sigh. "It's just, something happened on the playground yesterday." As she recounted the events of the playground, her voice grew quieter with each word. She described how the black girl had approached the jungle gym, how she had felt a wave of frustration when she saw her there, and how the words had just come out. "I told her to leave," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I said she didn't belong there." Her father's brow furrowed deeply, and her mother's face softened with a mixture of disappointment and concern. The silence that followed was heavy, and the girls squirmed under their gazes. "Why would you say something like that?" her mother asked finally, her tone steady but tinged with sadness. "I don't know," the girl replied, her voice defensive. "It's just, she was always there, taking up space. And she stopped herself, realizing how weak her excuse sounded. "I didn't mean it to be bad," she added, her voice faltering. Her father leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Sweetheart, those words were more than bad. Do you understand how hurtful that was? To make someone feel like they don't belong, do you know how that feels?" The girl didn't answer, her cheeks burning with shame. She had been so caught up in her frustration that she hadn't thought about how her words might have made the other girl feel. Her mother broke the silence. "I need to tell you a story," she said, her voice softer now. The girl looked up, surprised. Her mother rarely talked about herself this way. "When I was your age," her mother began, "I had a best friend named Maya. Maya was black, and we did everything together, played, studied, even had sleepovers. But there was this one day at school, one of the older girls came up to us during recess and told Maya she couldn't play on the swings with the rest of us. She said it was because the swings were for kids who fit in." Her mother paused, her jaw tightening at the memory. "Do you know what I did?" The girl shook her head, her eyes wide. "I stayed quiet," her mother said, her voice heavy with regret. "I didn't stand up for her. I didn't say anything. And I've regretted it ever since." The girl blinked, startled. "You didn't say anything?" "No," her mother admitted. "And Maya cried that day. We stayed friends for a while, but things were never the same. She moved schools a few years later, and I never got the chance to make it right." Her father chimed in, his voice firm but kind. "What your mom's trying to say is that words matter. And so does silence. What you said hurt that girl, but you have a chance to do something about it. To make it right." The girl's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at her lap. "What if she doesn't forgive me?" she whispered. "That's not the point," her mother said gently. "The point is that you try. You take responsibility for what you said, and you show her that you're sorry. Whether she forgives you or not, you'll know you did the right thing." Her father nodded. "And maybe you'll learn something about yourself in the process." That night, the girl lay awake in bed, her mother's story replaying in her mind. She thought about Maya, about the swings, and about how her mother must have felt carrying that regret for so long. She thought about the black girl on the playground, the way she had looked as she walked away, and the quiet weight of her own words. For the first time, she realized that making things right wasn't about fixing what had already happened, it was about being better moving forward. And as she drifted off to sleep, she resolved to try, no matter how hard it might be. That evening, the black girl sat cross-legged on her bed, her hands fidgeting with the beads in her braids. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the television in the living room. She hadn't told anyone about what had happened on the playground, but the memory of the white girl's words still echoed in her mind. There was a knock on her door. Before she could answer, it creaked open, and her older brother, Malcolm, stepped inside. He was tall and lanky, his basketball jersey hanging loose on his frame. He had always been her protector, the one who made her laugh when she was sad. But tonight, his expression was serious. "Mom said you didn't eat dinner," Malcolm said, leaning against the doorframe. "What's going on, kiddo?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around one of her braids. "Nothing," she muttered. He raised an eyebrow and stepped closer. "Come on. I know you better than that. Talk to me." For a moment, she considered brushing him off, but the weight in her chest was too heavy to carry alone. She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Something happened at the playground," she whispered. As she recounted the events of the previous day, Malcolm listened intently, his arms crossed and his jaw tightening with each word. When she described the white girl's shout, asterisk asterisk, "You don't belong here," asterisk asterisk, his fists clenched at his sides. "She said that to you?" he asked, his voice low and steady, but with a sharp edge. "And no one said anything? No one stood up for you?" The girl shook her head, her voice barely audible. "They just watched." Malcolm took a deep breath, running a hand over his face. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said, his voice softer now. He sat down beside her on the bed, draping an arm over her shoulders. "But you need to know, this isn't about you. It's about her and how she was raised. People say things like that because they don't understand. Or because they're scared of what's different? She looked up at him, her brow furrowed. Did it ever happen to you? His face darkened, and for a moment, he seemed far away. Yeah, he said finally. A lot. Malcolm began to share stories he had never told her before. He talked about the time a teacher had called him disruptive just for asking a question in class. How the security guard at the mall had followed him and his friends for no reason, watching their every move. And how, once, during a basketball game, an opposing player had muttered a slur under his breath. What did you do? The girl asked, her voice small. I wanted to fight him, Malcolm admitted. But I didn't. I knew if I did, it'd just prove everything he thought about me. So I kept my head up, played harder, and beat him on the court. After the game, I walked right past him like he didn't even exist. She stared at him, her admiration mixed with sadness. Does it ever stop? She asked. Malcolm sighed, his arm tightening around her shoulders. I don't know, he said honestly. But I do know this, every time we stand tall, every time we refuse to let them define us, we win a little bit of the fight. And one day, things will change. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but someday. Their conversation didn't go unnoticed. Their mother, who had been passing by the door, stopped to listen. Hearing Malcolm's words, her heart ached. She had hoped to shield her children from the harsh realities she had faced growing up, but now it was clear that silence wasn't the answer. Later that night, she and their father sat down with both children at the kitchen table. It was time to speak openly about the injustices they all faced and the resilience they needed to overcome them. Their mother began by sharing her own stories, how she had been turned away from a job interview despite her qualifications, how she had been pulled over for no reason other than the color of her skin. Their father, usually quiet, spoke of the microaggressions he dealt with daily, from colleagues who assumed he was less competent to strangers who clutched their purses tighter when he walked by. We didn't want you to carry this burden, their mother said, her voice heavy with emotion. But the world isn't always fair. That doesn't mean we stop fighting. It means we fight smarter, stronger, together. For the first time, the girl understood that her experience on the playground was part of something much larger. It wasn't just about one moment or one person, it was about a history of prejudice and the ongoing fight for equality. And as painful as it was, she felt a sense of strength in knowing she wasn't alone. By the time they left the table, she felt lighter, her brothers' and parents' words still echoing in her mind. As she climbed into bed that night, she resolved to face the playground again, not with fear, but with the quiet courage her family had shown her was possible. The playground buzzed with its usual energy as children darted across the jungle gym and swung high into the air. But for two girls, the day was anything but ordinary. The black girl stood at the far edge of the playground, near the fence, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape with trepidation. She had debated coming back here, the sting of humiliation still fresh in her mind. But her brother's words, every time we stand tall, we win a little bit of the fight, had convinced her to try. On the other side of the playground, the white girl sat on the edge of the slide, nervously twisting the hem of her shirt. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say all night, but now that she saw the black girl standing there, her stomach churned. The weight of her actions felt heavier in the bright light of the morning. She stood up slowly, brushing invisible dust from her jeans, and began walking toward her. The black girl noticed her approach and stiffened, her fists clenching at her sides. She thought about turning away, walking to another corner, but something inside her held her ground. As the white girl came closer, she slowed, her steps hesitant. "Hi," the white girl said softly, stopping a few feet away. The black girl didn't respond. She simply stared, her expression unreadable. I wanted to say I'm sorry," the white girl continued, her voice trembling. "For what I said. It was wrong, and I shouldn't have said it." The black girl's eyes narrowed slightly, her arms crossing over her chest. "Why did you say it then?" she asked, her tone sharp. The white girl flushed, looking down at her sneakers. "I don't know," she admitted. "I was mad, and I just said it. But I didn't mean it, I swear." The black girl let out a short, humorless laugh. "You didn't mean it? You told me I didn't belong here. How do you not mean that?" Their conversation began to draw attention. A few kids nearby stopped what they were doing, their eyes darting between the two girls. One boy, perched on top of the monkey bars, leaned over to his friend and whispered, "What's going on over there?" The murmurs spread quickly, and soon a small group of children had formed a loose circle around the girls, their curiosity piqued. The black girl noticed them, her shoulders tensing under their stares. The white girl noticed too, her face reddening with embarrassment. "I'm trying to apologize," the white girl said, louder now, glancing nervously at the growing crowd. "Looks like it's too late for that," a boy muttered, crossing his arms. He was one of the white girl's friends, and he smirked as he added, "Why even bother? She shouldn't have been here in the first place." The black girl's jaw tightened, her fists clenching again. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another voice cut through the air. "Yeah," a girl chimed in from the swing set. "Why does she care so much about this dumb playground anyway?" The tension in the air grew heavier as the circle of children closed in slightly. Some of them looked uneasy, shifting their weight from foot to foot, while others seemed eager to stir the pot. The white girl's face burned with shame. This wasn't what she had intended. "Stop it," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She turned to the boy who had spoken first. "This isn't about you." "Oh, so now you're on her side," he shot back, his smirk fading into a scowl. "Make up your mind." The black girl, who had stayed silent as the others argued, finally stepped forward. Her voice was steady, but her eyes flashed with defiance. "You think I don't belong here because I'm different," she said, her gaze sweeping over the group. "But I'm just as much a part of this playground as any of you. And if you have a problem with that, that's your problem, not mine." Her words silenced the murmurs, leaving the group in a stunned hush. Even the boy on the monkey bars looked down, uncertain of what to say. The white girl stared at her, a mix of admiration and guilt rising in her chest. "I'm sorry," the white girl said again, her voice breaking. This time, the black girl met her eyes, and for the first time, there was a flicker of understanding. The tension began to dissolve, and the circle of children slowly dispersed. Some wandered back to their games, while others lingered, their expressions thoughtful. The black girl stayed where she was, watching as the white girl turned to leave. "Wait," the black girl called, her voice softer now. The white girl stopped, looking back at her. "If you really mean it, maybe we can start over." The white girl's face lit up with a small, tentative smile. "I'd like that." As the two girls began to talk, the playground returned to its usual rhythm. But for those who had witnessed the confrontation, something had changed. The unspoken rules of the playground had been challenged, and a new sense of possibility lingered in the air. The tension on the playground didn't stay confined to the children. Whispers of what had happened began to ripple through the school community, reaching the ears of teachers and parents. By the end of the week, the principal called an emergency meeting, inviting parents to discuss the increasing conflicts among the students. The meeting took place in the school's modest auditorium. Rows of metal folding chairs filled the space, parents filtering in with curious and concerned expressions. At the front of the room, the principal stood behind a podium, flanked by two teachers and the school counselor. The air was thick with unease, and the murmurs among the parents quickly quieted as the principal cleared her throat. "We've called this meeting," she began, her tone formal but measured, "because there have been reports of tension and incidents of exclusion among students on the playground. We believe it's important to address this as a community." The first few minutes were filled with procedural discussions about playground supervision and policies on bullying. But as parents began to raise their hands, the conversation took a sharp turn. "I don't understand why we're having this meeting," one mother said, her tone clipped. "Kids fight. They'll get over it." "It's not just about kids fighting," the school counselor interjected gently. "This is about words and actions that make some children feel like they don't belong. That's not something they can just get over." Another parent, a father in a neatly pressed suit, raised his hand. "But isn't this being blown out of proportion? We're talking about children. They don't understand these things the way adults do. It's not like they're trying to be malicious." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but it was cut short by the voice of a black mother sitting near the back. "Maybe they don't understand," she said firmly, "but that doesn't make the harm any less real. My daughter came home in tears because of what was said to her. How is that not malicious?" The room fell silent for a moment, the tension palpable. The principal stepped in, her voice cautious. "We understand that emotions are running high, and we want to find solutions that work for everyone. But we also need to acknowledge that some behaviors are rooted in deeper issues." That was when a voice from the middle of the room broke through, sharp and unapologetic. "Well, maybe if certain kids didn't act like they owned the place, there wouldn't be any problems." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. Gasps and murmurs erupted across the room, and the black mother stood up, her face a mixture of shock and fury. "What is that supposed to mean?" she demanded. The parent who had spoken, a man in a baseball cap and faded hoodie, shrugged defensively. "I'm just saying, some kids don't know how to fit in. And maybe it's not our job to make them comfortable." The principal quickly stepped forward, her hands raised in an attempt to calm the room. "Let's keep this civil," she urged, though her own voice wavered slightly. But the damage was done. The comment had exposed an undercurrent of prejudice that no one could ignore. Parents began to argue, their voices overlapping in a chaotic swirl of anger and defensiveness. "This is exactly the problem," the black mother shouted over the noise. "You act like it's our fault for existing. Like we're the ones causing trouble just by being here." Her words struck a chord with others. A few parents nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. But others crossed their arms, their expressions hardening. One teacher, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, finally stood. "We're here to talk about the kids," she said, her voice clear and firm. "But let's not pretend they're the only ones learning these behaviors. Children hear what we say, they see how we act, and they reflect that back on each other. If we want to fix this, we need to start with ourselves." The room quieted as her words sank in. Some parents looked down at their hands, others stared straight ahead, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. The black mother sat back down, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The man in the baseball cap shifted uncomfortably but said nothing more. By the end of the meeting, the room felt fractured. The principal outlined plans for diversity training and anti-bullying programs, but the energy in the room suggested that not everyone was on board. As the parents began to leave, the conversations continued in hushed tones, some parents avoiding each other entirely. Outside, the black mother stood with her daughter, her hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Another parent approached her, a woman she had never spoken to before. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice trembling. "For what he said. For everything. It's not right." The black mother nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you," she said. "But words aren't enough. We need action." As they walked to their car, the black girl glanced up at her mother. "Do you think they'll change?" she asked quietly. Her mother sighed, her grip on her daughter's shoulder tightening. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we'll keep fighting until they do." The auditorium was packed. Rows of students shuffled in their seats, whispering to one another as the teachers directed them to quiet down. The school assembly had been called as part of a new initiative to address inclusion and kindness, but most of the kids saw it as just another excuse to skip class. At the center of the stage stood the principal, a clipboard in hand, her face strained as she addressed the crowd. "Today, we want to hear from one of your peers," she said, her voice amplified through the microphone. "She's here to share her experience and her perspective on why words and actions matter." The black girl sat backstage, her heart pounding in her chest. She clutched the small note cards in her hand, though she barely glanced at them. This was her chance to finally say what had been simmering inside her for weeks. But the weight of so many eyes waiting beyond the curtain made her hands tremble. "You've got this," whispered Mr. Garcia, her teacher, who stood beside her for support. "Just speak from the heart." She nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping onto the stage. The murmurs in the crowd faded as she approached the microphone, her small frame illuminated by the spotlight. For a moment, the silence felt unbearable. Then she began. "When I was little," she said, her voice clear but shaking slightly, "I thought school was supposed to be a place where everyone felt like they belonged. But lately, I haven't felt that way." Her words hung in the air, and she took another deep breath, steadying herself. "A few weeks ago, something happened to me on the playground. Someone told me I didn't belong there. That I should go somewhere else. And the worst part wasn't just the words, it was that no one stood up for me." The room was silent now, the shuffle of feet and whispers replaced by the quiet tension of listening. "I felt invisible," she continued. "Like I didn't matter. And that feeling doesn't just stay on the playground. It follows you home. It keeps you up at night. It makes you wonder if it's true." She glanced at the crowd, scanning the faces of her classmates. Some stared back at her, their expressions thoughtful. Others avoided her gaze, their faces flushed with discomfort. "But I'm here to tell you," she said, her voice growing stronger, "that those words were wrong. I do belong. Just like every one of you belongs. And if you ever feel like someone's trying to make you smaller, you need to remember that." She paused, the emotion thick in her throat. "It's not just about me, though. It's about all of us. About how we treat each other. Because every time we laugh at someone's pain, every time we stay quiet when we know something's wrong, we're telling them they don't matter. And that's not okay." The crowd was a patchwork of reactions. Some students leaned forward, their faces etched with empathy. A boy near the front wiped his eyes quickly, hoping no one would notice. But in the back, a few students whispered and rolled their eyes, their arms crossed in defiance. One voice broke the silence, a muttered, "She's just being dramatic," that rippled through the nearby rows. The girl faltered for a moment, catching the smirk on the face of a classmate she recognized from the playground. But she squared her shoulders and pressed on. "I know not everyone's going to understand," she said, addressing the room but glancing briefly at the smirking student. "And that's okay. But I hope at least some of you will think about what you say and do. Because it matters more than you know." When she finished, there was a moment of silence before the applause began. It started tentatively, a few claps here and there, but quickly grew into a wave. Teachers nodded approvingly, and some students cheered. But not everyone joined in, pockets of resistance remained, students who crossed their arms or whispered to one another. As she stepped off the stage, she was met by Mr. Garcia, who smiled warmly. "You did amazing," he said. Her mother, who had been sitting in the back, approached with tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, pulling her into a tight hug. Over the next few days, the impact of her speech became clear. Some students approached her in the hallways, offering quiet words of support. Others began standing up for classmates in small but meaningful ways. Even some of the teachers seemed more attentive, more deliberate in fostering an inclusive environment. But the whispers of resistance persisted. A few students avoided her altogether, their discomfort with her courage manifesting as coldness. One even muttered, "Attention seeker," as she walked past. It stung, but she reminded herself of her brother's words, "Every time you stand tall, you win a little bit of the fight." And she had stood tall. For herself. For others. And for the kind of school she knew they could become. The morning after the school assembly, the principal called a staff meeting. Sitting at the head of a long conference table, she looked at her team of teachers, counselors, and administrators with a mix of urgency and determination. "What happened on the playground, and what we heard at the assembly, can't be ignored," she began. "This isn't just about one incident, it's about the environment we've created here. It's time we take action." The teachers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably. One veteran teacher spoke up. "I think we've all seen these issues, but it's hard to address them when they're so ingrained. Where do we even start?" The principal leaned forward. "We start by listening to the kids. We bring in experts, activists, and educators who know how to have these conversations. And we commit to changing the culture here, no matter how hard it might be." Over the next week, the school partnered with a local organization that specialized in promoting diversity and inclusion. Workshops were planned for students and staff alike, covering topics like implicit bias, cultural understanding, and the impact of words. Parents were invited to participate in evening seminars, and posters promoting kindness and respect began to appear in the hallways. The white girl's parents were among those who attended the parent seminars. At first, they weren't sure what to expect. Her father had been hesitant, muttering about overcorrection, but her mother insisted they go. During the seminar, a facilitator asked the parents to think about their own experiences with prejudice, whether as victims, bystanders, or participants. The white girl's mother shared her story about her friend Maya, the one she had told her daughter. By the end of the session, even her father admitted that there was more to this issue than he had realized. For the students, the workshops were eye-opening. The white girl, in particular, found herself grappling with emotions she hadn't expected. One session focused on the power of words, and the facilitator asked the group to write down something hurtful they had said or heard and how it might have affected someone. She hesitated, staring at the blank paper in front of her. Finally, she wrote, "You don't belong here." The memory of saying those words made her chest tighten, but she forced herself to keep going. Beneath it, she added, "I think I hurt her more than I thought. I didn't mean to, but that doesn't matter." When it was her turn to share, her voice trembled. "I said something really mean to someone. I didn't think about how much it would hurt them, but now I can't stop thinking about it." The facilitator nodded, their expression kind but firm. Acknowledging the harm is the first step. Now, what can you do to make sure it doesn't happen again? The workshops didn't just focus on understanding, they also emphasized action. Students were encouraged to form ally groups, where they could discuss ways to support one another and stand up against exclusion. The white girl joined one of the groups, sitting beside students she hadn't spoken to much before, including the black girl. Their initial interactions were awkward, filled with hesitant smiles and long silences. But over time, they began to talk more openly. One afternoon, during a group discussion, the white girl turned to the black girl and said, "I'm really sorry for what I said to you. I know I've said it before, but I really mean it." The black girl studied her for a moment before replying, "I know. And I think you're trying. That's a start." The changes didn't come overnight, but they were noticeable. Teachers began to intervene more actively when they saw or heard something inappropriate. Students who had once stayed silent started speaking up for their classmates. Even the playground felt different, less divided, more inclusive. The white girl found herself seeing the world in new ways. She noticed things she had never paid attention to before, the way certain kids were treated differently, the offhand comments that once seemed harmless but now struck her as cruel. She began to ask questions, both of others and of herself. One day, she asked her parents, why do people think it's okay to treat others like that? Like they're less than? Her mother paused, her expression thoughtful. Because sometimes it's easier to believe someone else is the problem than to look at yourself. But it's our job to do better, to teach and to learn. By the end of the school year, the white girl had become one of the most active members of the ally group. She and the black girl weren't exactly friends, but they had found a mutual respect that felt like progress. During a final assembly, the principal praised the students for their efforts, highlighting the changes that had taken root. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's just the beginning. We're building a school where everyone feels like they belong. And that starts with all of you." As the applause filled the auditorium, the white girl glanced at the black girl and offered a small, tentative smile. The black girl hesitated, then smiled back. It was a quiet moment, but it spoke volumes, a symbol of the work that had been done and the work that still lay ahead. The playground looked different now. It wasn't just the posters on the walls or the new rules about inclusion, it was the atmosphere. Laughter carried without hesitation, and children played together in ways they hadn't before. But the most noticeable difference was between two girls who, weeks ago, couldn't have stood farther apart. The black girl sat on a swing, her braids catching the sunlight as she pumped her legs back and forth. Nearby, the white girl crouched at the edge of the sandbox, carefully constructing the base of a castle. From time to time, their eyes met, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. "You want to help?" the white girl asked, glancing up from her work. The black girl slowed her swing, dragging her feet in the dirt before stepping off. "Sure," she said with a shrug, though the corners of her mouth twitched into a smile. They worked together quietly at first, the awkwardness between them lingering like a faint shadow. But as the castle grew, so did their conversation. They talked about their favorite TV shows, their pets, and the teachers they liked best. Slowly, the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable began to dissolve. At home, the transformation extended to their families. The white girl's mother reached out to the black girl's parents, inviting them over for coffee one Saturday afternoon. The initial meeting was cautious, both sides unsure how to navigate the shared history of hurt and misunderstanding. But as the conversation deepened, they found common ground, not just in their desire to protect their children, but in their shared hope for a better future. "We want to do more," the black girl's mother said, her voice steady. "Not just for our kids, but for all the kids in this community." The white girl's father nodded. "Let's start with something simple. Maybe a workshop for parents. If we can educate ourselves, we can set a better example for them." The idea blossomed into a series of community events. The two families collaborated with local activists and educators, hosting open forums, cultural celebrations, and storytelling nights where people could share their experiences. The events drew more families than they expected, creating a ripple effect that spread through the town. At one of the events, the black girl stood on stage, her voice clear and confident as she shared her story. "I used to think I was the only one who felt out of place," she said. "But now I know I wasn't alone. And I've learned that it's okay to stand up for yourself, and for others." When she stepped down, the white girl was waiting for her. "You were amazing," she said sincerely. "Thanks," the black girl replied, her smile wide. "Couldn't have done it without." Their friendship grew stronger with time. They started sitting together at lunch, their laughter becoming a familiar sound in the cafeteria. They worked on class projects together, combining their strengths in ways that impressed even their teachers. And on the playground, they became a symbol of the change that was possible, a reminder to others that kindness and understanding could bridge even the widest divides. One afternoon, as they walked home together, the white girl hesitated before speaking. "I'm really glad we're friends," she said, her cheeks flushing slightly. The black girl looked at her, surprised but pleased. "Me too," she said. "And not just because of the sandbox skills." They both laughed, the sound light and easy. The journey wasn't without its challenges. There were still moments of tension, misunderstandings that needed to be worked through. But the difference now was that they faced those moments together, with a commitment to listening, learning, and growing. As the school year came to an end, the girls stood side by side at the final assembly, watching as their principal praised the progress the school had made. "This is just the beginning," she said. "The work we've done here will only matter if we carry it forward. And I know this community is capable of incredible things." The black girl and the white girl exchanged a smile, a silent promise that they would continue to carry that work forward, together. What did you think of this story? Have you ever experienced or witnessed something similar? Share your thoughts in the comments, we'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Together, we can keep spreading hope, understanding, and kindness.